Well, hello, friends. I'm excited to be back with you for yet another Beyond Compliance. My name is Jim Albright, and today we are going to dig into some of the ways that you can use your data to better identify trends, reduce risks, and boost your continuous improvement efforts. Now, I know we have some new folks who have joined, so I just want to give a little bit of an overview to what compliance is. This is a series that exists to bring industry leaders and experts who share their perspectives on the influences, challenges, and impacts that are shaping process manufacturing today. The series aims to provide real-world guidance that manufacturers can use to help change and evolve their business processes, technologies, and outcomes. And the best part is you get a chance to take part in the discussion because you get to submit your comments and questions. Now, this series is brought to you by Safety Chain. Safety Chain provides an end-to-end plant management platform that unites production, quality, and compliance to help manufacturers consistently improve yield, maximize productivity, and ensure compliance. So before we get started with today's topic, I do have a few housekeeping items. We've muted all attendee mics, but as I said, you can submit your questions and comments into the webinar panel at any time during the session because we will be saving time at the end for some Q&A. And yes, this session is being recorded, so all attendees will be receiving the link to the recording and the presentation slides later on today. All right, let's meet our speaker. I'm very excited to have with us Tammie Van Buren, who is the Manager of Compliance over at the SQF Institute. Tammie has extensive quality and safety experience and has been responsible for building SQFI's compliance and integrity program since 2019. So Tammie, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here.
Yeah, well, since this is your first time here, I thought maybe you could provide a little information about yourself and a little bit more about SQFI and just lead us into this topic.
All right, absolutely. So SQFI is the owner of the SQF Food Safety Program, and we are a GFSI benchmarked program. And we currently have about 11,000 certified sites around the world. We are global. And, you know, as the compliance manager, I get to deal with a lot of sites. I get to deal with our certification bodies, our auditors, anything that helps to support the program. And so prior to that, I have about 30 years of experience in quality control. I started off in the automotive industry and switched to food safety about 10 years ago. And so, I always tell sites I can relate because I was an SQF practitioner. I worked in a manufacturing facility for several years and implemented the SQF system. So I bring that to the table when sites have questions or concerns or need some information on something. I understand what they're talking about and where they're coming from. So I just have enjoyed the last 3 years at SQFI and am looking forward to the future and where we can take SQF even further to expand our outreach as well. So.
Absolutely. I don't think there's anybody on this webinar right now who hasn't heard of SQFI, so we're really, really lucky to have you here today, so appreciate it.
Thank you. All right, are we ready to get started? Let me get my slides going. All right, so we have 3 takeaways for you today. Normally, I give my key takeaways at the end, you know, after I've already talked, and then I remind you of those things that you should take from the information I just presented. But with this opportunity today, I'm going to give you those key takeaways from the beginning. That way you can kind of anticipate what we're going to go through, and you can, you know, really be prepared to take notes and things like that. So first of all, we're going to identify ways that data can assist in continuous improvement. And, you know, I started with this because continuous improvement, that's expected. We expect our certified sites to continuously improve. And I'm going to give you some examples today on how SQFI continuously improves by using data. And I just wanted to show that not only do we expect it from our sites, but we also live it every day. So I've got some examples to show you how we do that. Then I also want to talk about utilizing data to predict risk. If you're familiar with the SQF code, you know, we are a risk-based code, and throughout our requirements, you will see where there's lots of opportunities for a site to do a risk assessment. So I just want to talk about how you can take data and use that to complete your risk assessment. So I have an example on that as well. And then the last one is gain a better understanding of how to identify trends in data. So again, the SQF code requires you to identify trends and to act upon those trends. And so we're going to spend just a little bit of time talking about how you can identify those trends within your data. And hopefully you'll be able to take some of this information today and apply it at your facility. And yeah, I'm a statistics person. I love data analysis. I am all about the data. So I was very excited to be able to share this presentation with you guys. All right, so first off, like I said, we're going to talk about continuous improvement. It is expected for anybody that is SQF certified, and so we're going to, start off with that. I've got some data sources that we use here at SQF. And so I wanted just to give you an idea of all the information that we collect, that we use data for, and then I'll give you those examples. So looking at those data sources, we talk a lot about top nonconformances. We have those all the time. And I've got, several sites that will request that information every year so they can, oversee, their company and how they've been doing. We collect that through our audit database, but we also use Power BI. And, one of the things with this slide is I really wanted to show you how those we collect the data, but also want to show you how we utilize the data. So we collect it in our database, but we use Power BI to analyze it. We also collect a lot of information around recalls and outbreaks, and so we have a third party that provides us with information on recalls around the world. We will get notification of several thousand around the globe each year. And so we collect that information, use it to help drive improvement in our code. I also spend time on the Food Industry Council's database for recalls. So if you're familiar with that, there's the database out there that has 22 years worth of FDA and USDA recalls in it, and you can search by company, you can search by product, by recall type. There's lots of great information that you can identify and utilize in that database there. So we use that on a frequent basis as well. We talk a lot about audit scores, and I have a compliance database. We've been using it for a little over a year now, and it allows me to look at our compliance information, and it actually flags data anomalies for me. So, I'm what they call the Excel queen. I use pivot tables a lot to analyze data, but we really strengthened our ability to identify data anomalies with our new compliance database. And it saves me a lot of time. What would have taken me a considerable amount of time to analyze the data in Excel, I can now have the database do some of the work for me. So that's been a lifesaver for sure. And then we talk a lot about audit preparation to our auditors and to our certification bodies, because just like a site, prepares for their auditor to come on board and be prepared to share records and procedures, the expectation is that the auditor prepares for the audit. So we talk to them a lot about, using their internet search engines to identify when specific sites have had issues or concerns, or using that regulatory dashboard. If you haven't used the FDA regulatory dashboard, I was just in there yesterday looking up a site. Someone had a question about a site's performance, and that dashboard will go back 10 years or further to show you every inspection, every regulatory warning letter. It tells you the violations and the corrective action. So it's a really great source of information. And then the last one is surveys. My gosh, we do offer a lot of surveys. We offer a site survey for any site that has been SQF certified. And if you want to supply some information about your auditor performance, your CB performance, you can do that through our site survey. And that provides us an opportunity. It can be done anonymously too. So you can just share with me how the auditor did, because I take that information and then we implement corrective actions if needed, or we improve our training, things like that. And I do have an example from how we do that. We use SurveyMonkey, but there's lots of different ways out there that you can take those surveys. But I just wanted to demonstrate for you guys that we have a lot of data, and there are a lot of data sources out there, and it just is up to you all to find what works for you, because there is just an unlimited amount of sources out there to get a lot of this information. All right, getting used to this screen here. All right, so continuous improvement. One of the ways, as I said, I've got some examples on how SQFI does continuous improvement. So my first one here is, we use data to improve our codes. So I'm sure some of you out there are aware Edition 9 came out, was implemented in May of 2021. And so there were some pretty big changes for Edition 9. And some of you may wonder, well, how does SQFI come up with those changes? Where do you get the information to put in new requirements or update requirements within the code? So I wanted to share with you one of the things. If you've been certified to Edition 9, you may be familiar with label reconciliation. So label reconciliation was a new requirement for Edition 9. It came about from recall data. So we look at recall data and determined that the top reason for recalls among SQF certified sites for many years in a row was undeclared allergens due to the wrong product being put in a label. And so a site might be running something that doesn't have dairy in it, and then they switch to a product that does have dairy in it. And so they forget to change their labels, or there's a few during the changeover process that accidentally got left in the packaging machine. So the wrong product, one with an allergen, got put into a label that did not declare dairy or whatever on the label. So we saw that as an issue. So we decided we needed to strengthen our changeover process, and that we needed to implement something that would not necessarily prevent a site from doing it, but would help a site to identify when it occurred so that they could catch it before it left their facility. And reconciliation of labels was the way that we elected to do that. So you can look there. The one on the left is our recall categories prior to Edition 9. Chemical, as I said, was always the leading category for recalls. Biological, physical coming in second and third. A distant fourth was other, those things like regulatory recalls where maybe something missed inspection, or the wrong label was used, but it did not have an allergen involved, so it didn't fall into chemical. But then once those recall categories were analyzed after Edition 9, we saw that the biological, the physical, the other, those pretty well stayed the same, but chemical is no longer our number one recall category. It is now number two. And so I believe we did make an impact by putting in that label reconciliation requirement and really strengthening the changeover process as a part of Edition 9 code. So that's how we use data to drive improvements and changes to our code. Now, you know, we're not looking for Edition 10 to come out anytime soon, so don't anybody panic. I just got back from our SQF conference in Orlando last week. There was talk, everybody wanted to know, when's Edition 10 coming out? And the answer is not anytime soon. So it takes us 18 months to 24 months to develop a new edition of the code. And so we haven't started on Edition 10. So you can, you know, you can just almost be assured that 2023, you're not going to see a new edition of the code, and very highly unlikely that you would see a new edition in 2024. If it is, it would be very, very late in the year, but more likely it would be something around 2025 before you see a new edition of the SQF code come out. So as my manager said, my VP, she said, never say never, but that's pretty well what we're shooting for. So not anytime soon, but probably a couple years from now. So that's how we use it, and we will continue to use data to drive our code improvements. Another example and ways that we use continuous improvement is with our training. So when Edition 9 was first implemented, there was something called food safety culture that was introduced for Edition 9. It was always inherent in the code. Food safety culture was always there, but we specifically called it out in Edition 9. There were specific requirements around having a good food safety culture. And so we began to analyze the data when we saw audit reports coming in, and we started seeing non-conformances to food safety culture. And what we realized is that not everybody had a good idea of what the requirement was. And so we started seeing non-conformances come in for the site didn't have a food safety culture program or a plan or a food safety culture procedure, or they didn't include the words food safety culture in their policy statement. And if you really look at the code and read it, none of those things are required. You don't have to put the words food safety culture in your policy statement. You don't have to have a food safety culture procedure. What the code says is that senior leadership at your site will support food safety culture. And then it gives some things that have to be in place. So you have to have objectives. Your personnel have to be aware of how they impact food safety culture and have to understand that they have the ability to stop anything that is a food safety concern. So there were requirements, but at no time did we say you had to have a procedure that was called a food safety culture procedure. So we jumped in, we updated our training for all of our new auditors, and then we used our quarterly update meetings to educate our existing auditors on what the intent was behind the requirements for food safety culture. And as you can see there on the screen, I've got the data. In 2021, you know, it was about 7 months worth of data. We saw 22 majors and 385 minors to food safety culture. And so that's when we decide we need to make changes. So for 2022, about the first 7 months of 2022, after we had made those changes, we saw a significant reduction in majors to food safety culture as well as minors. And the quality of those non-conformances were real. I mean, they indicated that there was a problem with food safety culture. They were very meaningful non-conformances and not something like you need to write a procedure. Okay, so yeah, that's how we utilize data to update our training. And you know, I just think that it's so important that when you use data and you can see those results as we see here in this example. And then for my last example, I'm talking about surveys. I said, we do surveys. We have a site survey. I analyze that data. I was with our certification bodies last week. We talked about the survey data. I shared with them the low ratings for specific auditors to drive continuous improvement. But we also identified that we have an issue right now with an auditor shortage. And if any of you all have been impacted, trying to get your audit scheduled within your audit window, and it can be a little bit frustrating because auditor availability can be low for some of our CBs. So we decided we needed to take a look at all those auditors that had started the registration process but never finished. So we have a list of auditors that are in the queue but aren't doing audits for one reason or another. So we felt like we needed to find out why. And so we reached out with an auditor registration survey and just asked people, hey, you started the process, so why haven't you finished it? And what are the barriers to keeping you from being an SQF registered auditor? And so it was very interesting because what we found is that people were starting the process and then realizing they didn't meet the criteria. So they were missing something. And so we thought, all right, so we gotta improve that. We gotta be better, and better communication, better review of the auditor criteria. We've got to get the word out so that when people come to us to start that registration process, they can complete that process and we can get them to work auditing. But some of the things that they mentioned was that the registration process was too difficult. So we feel like that we need to provide guidance on how to register. We use a third party to register all of our auditors. They review the criteria that the auditor presents. And so, you're navigating, a website and having to upload documents. And we created a new application that allows you to enter your information in. So, we've done some things. We've taken some action to try to reduce the difficulty of the registration process. Some unaware of the requirements. So they take the class that is required for them to take, auditing SQF, with our SQF technical team. I'm one of the instructors, as well as the VP of technical, Leanne. And so we conduct that training, and the very first night, focus on, here's the requirements. You have to have 5 years of industry experience, and you have to have 160 audit hours. And people are taking that course and then realizing, oh no, I only have 2 years of industry experience. And so 3 years of industry experience is not something you just gain overnight. And so that stalls their registration process. So one of the actions we've done is we've really analyzed our requirements to see if there was anything excessive or redundant, if there was any way that we could, get those people moving through the process. And so, yeah, I know some of our CBs, they're great at working to try to get some consulting experience with some of the applicants, getting some audit hours through our fundamentals program and GMP audits. So certification bodies will work with you to help you gain that experience. So we've put some actions in there. And then for some, the registration process was too overwhelming, and I get that. My goodness, there's a lot of moving pieces to it and a lot of information that you have to pull together. And so we've updated our training to where we really encourage potential applicants to get lined up with a certification body. You have to have a CB to sponsor you in order to be an auditor. So do that earlier, sooner in the process rather than later. We see a lot of applicants that wait till the very end and then they try to find a CB. So do that early. Find a CB willing to sponsor you, and then they will help you navigate that registration process. And so we've changed the way that we look at that type of steps in the process. And so I think that's going to help. I think we're going to see a lot less people start the registration process and fail to finish. But that'll be for next year. We'll analyze that data and see if we're better than we were this year. Because again, it's all about continuous improvement. And now we're going to talk about risk assessments, okay? So risk assessments, and I came across this quote. It kind of sums up for me, why we need to use data to make decisions. So most of the world will make decisions by either guessing or using their gut. They will either be lucky or wrong. And so I hope that you all are actually making data-driven decisions. And I'm hoping that you're not out there just getting by on luck, because at some point, people's luck does run out. And so I want to make sure that, it doesn't matter whether you're looking at KPIs or key performance indicators. A lot of sites will look at those and go, oh, I'm green, or I'm better than I was last year. They may be measuring themselves on the number of recalls or the number of quality holds. Customer complaints, that's another indicator that we use to measure how good we are. And I'm just not sure that we're utilizing the data to the fullest. Because sometimes we may just be lucky, and we don't want to get by on luck when it comes to food safety and quality. So use that data. So I'm going to give you an example today on how to use data to assess risk, because the SQF code talks about risk assessments a lot. So I'm just going to give you a quick example on how you could use data to do a risk assessment. So I have an example. But first, I want to just give you a quick reminder of what hazard and risk means. So we talk about a hazard analysis, we talk about a risk assessment. So a hazard is those things that have the potential to cause harm. So you're looking at physical contaminants, biological, chemical. So you're identifying those hazards that can lead to that undesirable effect. The risk is what is the likelihood of the harm and the severity of the harm that takes place when someone's exposed to a hazard. So you do your hazard analysis, then you have your risk assessment that takes those hazards that you've identified, and you're assessing risk. So the example I'm going to use today is, what if you're looking for a new supplier? So I'm sure some of you all have felt the pain of disrupted supply chain over the last couple of years. Disrupted, lack of a workforce can sometimes do that, lack of ingredients. We've seen lots of ways that our supply chain has been disrupted through the pandemic, and then even coming out of the pandemic hasn't necessarily recovered yet. So you may be looking for an alternate supplier. Now, my background is baked goods, so I use an example. So what if I'm looking for an alternate supplier for cinnamon? So that's one of those, spices that bakers need in order to make those tasty treats. And, sometimes there are supply chain issues, and getting what you need needs to be assessed. So if you're doing a risk assessment, you need to have some type of a risk assessment matrix. I have an example on the screen today. That's not the only way you can do it. I've got low, moderate, high, and critical risk level categories. But you know what? You don't have to use 4 different. I see lots of matrices that only have 3 levels. Maybe it's low, medium, and high. So get one that works for you, and identify the severity and the likelihood in a way to quantify those. So in this case, I've got from rare occurrence all the way up to almost certain occurrence for my likelihood. And I've got insignificant severity all the way up to something being catastrophic. And then the color coding just helps you to see exactly what that risk level is, and that will help us make a decision later on. So just keep that in mind. So when we're looking at finding an alternate supplier, you know, there are several things we need to consider. I picked out 2 things today that I want to talk about. So food fraud and recalls. So we're going to start with food fraud. And if I were assessing a new supplier to determine if I could use this alternate supplier for my cinnamon, some of the things I would look at, I would consider likelihood of food fraud. And so when I looked up the likelihood of food fraud for cinnamon, there are all kinds of examples of pure cinnamon being diluted with other species of cinnamon, and some containing high levels of coumarin, which we know causes liver issues and can cause an increased risk of cancer. So that's the history of fraud on that ingredient. Okay, so not just looking at that supplier, that specific supplier that I'm looking at, but I'm looking at the history of the ingredient itself. And then I would take into consideration the economic consideration of that supplier. So, you know, if I could come back and say, all right, there's no economic issues, or maybe my potential new supplier has had some economic issues. Maybe they have had to, you know, close production for a certain period of time. Maybe they've had, you know, regulatory issues where they've, you know, been shut down or had to do some additional things that would impact their economy. So that's something to consider, because food fraud typically is born out of somebody that's trying to take advantage or make money off of our food supply in a very negative way. So they're substituting things, they're diluting things. So, you know, economic impact is huge when you're looking at food fraud. And then country of origin. My example today, I'm getting my cinnamon from Sri Lanka. I learned as I was doing my research is that pure cinnamon comes from Sri Lanka. So if you're purchasing your cinnamon from another company or another country, you need to find out the source or the origin where that cinnamon is coming from. And in order for it to be pure cinnamon, it has to come eventually, back at the beginning, it comes from Sri Lanka. And then you can look at things like what's the economic and political consideration in that country. So Sri Lanka's lower middle income nation, they've had some recent political protests. So that can also disrupt food supply, which can lead to some food fraud concerns as well. They have a food safety system, a regulatory act in Sri Lanka. It's the Food Act of 1980. You know, it's 40 years old, so it's established. It's been around for a while. I personally don't have any experience with the country because we don't have any SQF sites there. So that's something just in the back of my mind that, you know, I'm not sure about their food safety systems in that country of origin. But I would also look at severity. So could someone become ill or worse if the product is fraudulently supplied? And the answer here is absolutely yes. Okay, so we're going to take that into consideration when we're summing up our risk assessment. And then the next thing I want to look at is recalls. So recalls on cinnamon. And here I looked at the FDA USDA database as well as our own database on cinnamon and supply or certified sites that utilize that type of ingredient. And so what I found was there were 5 recalls in the last 3 years in the US on ground cinnamon. So that's, I mean, there's a few, okay? It's not a large number, but by any means, but there are a few instances of recalls. And then when I look at bakery and food ingredient, which would be the food sector categories most closely associated with cinnamon, we do see that those often fall in our top food sector categories for recalls. So just again, something to consider. Those recalls, those 5 recalls from the FDA, salmonella. There were a couple for salmonella. There was one for lead, and then there were a couple for food fraud. Because a different species of cinnamon had been used, and that's where you get into that coumarin risk, that those liver issues and the increased risk of cancer. So could someone become ill or worse? Absolutely. So now we've gathered our data. We've got data on food recall, we've got our food fraud, and we've got data on recalls, and we're going to make a decision on whether or not we could use an alternate supplier for cinnamon. And so I'm looking at the likelihood is possible. Okay, so it is based on the data, it is possible that we would have issues. Looking at the severity, I would really consider that major, because we talked about, you know, liver disease. We talked about increased risk of cancer. We talked about salmonella. We talked about lead. So there were definitely some pretty significant severe risk. So I would rate that a major. And so when I look at my major paired with my possible likelihood, I get a high rating. So my result could be that I will accept the alternate supplier with a mitigation plan. And what do I mean by that? You know, maybe I'm going to implement my own testing. So I'll do a hold and release for the cinnamon coming in from that supplier. I'll pull a sample, send it out for testing, hold it until the testing clears as good. And so that may be my mitigation plan. If they're a critical, then my answer would be no. I'm not going to use that alternate supplier because they fell in the critical risk level. If they're moderate, maybe I'll accept them with a different mitigation plan. So maybe I'm looking for that certificate of analysis that comes in with every shipment that has certain testing that's been done. And if they're low risk, then maybe I accept them with no mitigation plan. So that would be something that you would identify once you start that risk assessment process. So again, just an example of how you can use data to help complete your risk assessments, since risk assessments is a very important part of any food safety program. And now we're going to look at some data trends here. So you can see my quote here, Sherlock Holmes, you know, who doesn't love a good mystery? It's a capital mistake to theorize before one has data. So I always like to base any questions I answer or any comments I make on data, because like I said in the beginning, I am very much a data-driven person. All right, so let's look at what do we need to do to identify trends. And I'm going to give you 3 tips and techniques. So the first one is understanding your data. Make sure you have the right perspective. Don't be too focused on your data. So don't be so focused on one tree that you miss the forest around you, but also don't be too broad. So think about being in an airplane at 30,000 feet looking down. Can you see many details at that level? So, you know, you don't want to be too close to your data, but you also don't want to be too broad. And I've got an example for that. And then sometimes we have to transform our data. You know, I told you I am the Excel queen. I love a good pivot table, and I use them daily, but sometimes that's not the best way to look at data. You know, Pareto charts, histograms, control charts, is not matrix. And I'm going to talk to you about a measles diagram today that I did from my own personal experience. And then the last one is act. Follow through with actions to improve. You need to make sure you have an action plan. You've got due dates, people who's responsible, and how are you communicating the actions that you take. So we're going to dive a little bit deeper into those 3 different tips and techniques that I'm going to give you today. So understanding your data. So look at my cute little duck. You know, he looks like he's so innocent, right? Just a cute little duck minding his own business. But is that really what he is? So if I put my duck into perspective, He's actually that non-conformance. He's that employee that's not following your GMP requirements, regardless of your training. You know, he's that procedure that is not quite meeting the requirements. So he's that non-conformance. He's that piece of data that sticks out at us. So we need to make sure we understand. We didn't see that until we had the right perspective on him. We were too close. So my example today for that is, my slide is not, there we go. Okay, all right, Pareto chart. So my top 10 majors by element. If you're familiar with the SQF code, we have sections that break down into clauses, that break down into elements. And so here I've got the top 10 majors by element. So it's in my Pareto chart. So if I were to focus on somewhere to make an improvement, you know, say I'm a large company and, you know, I had 21 majors that were assigned to my company for pest prevention, then I would look at that Pareto chart and I'd say, you know what, that's where I need to start. I need to attack pest prevention because it's the #1 problem, right? So we'd start there. But let me show you a different perspective on that data. So if I back it up, I'm not down at the element level, but I back up to clauses and I look at my top 5 majors by clause. And I know you're saying, Tammie, you're only looking at the top 5 when before you were looking at the top 10. But I will tell you that the top 10 on the previous chart was representative of about 23% of my data. But when I pull in the top 5 clauses, I am now looking at 35% of my data. So 35 of my top 5 clauses of nonconformances fall into the top 5. All right, so I'm actually looking at more data, even though I'm using a top 5 versus a top 10. Now look what jumps up there. Food safety plan is suddenly 2.5 times any other clause, and pest prevention actually fell to #3. So was I perhaps too close to my data? I had gotten too granular with my data, looking at it by element. Would I be better served by looking at it by clause? So making sure we have that right perspective, that's so crucial when we're looking at our data. So now let's jump back and look at that top 10 again. How did we miss it? Well, I've got my top one here, pest prevention. It's circled in blue. But you know what? Food safety plan showed up on 4 of my top 10. And I totally missed that because I was so focused on that #1, because I just didn't have the right perspective on my data. So make sure you understand your data. And, you know, food safety plan is probably a better choice to start driving continuous improvement and make some changes. And then we're going to look at that transform your data. I don't know about you all, but I have kids, I have grandkids. They love transformers. And, you know, they love to play with those transformers as the robot, because sometimes you need the big, strong robot to engage in battle. But sometimes you just need the truck. Maybe you just need to get from point A to point B, and it's much faster to transform into the truck and go there. So it's the same exact way with our data. Sometimes we got to transform it to really make it useful. And I've got an example for that. So I told you I love Excel. You know, here's a spreadsheet of our environmental monitoring program. You know, we would occasionally get a presumptive positive in one of our, 50 swabs that we took each week for Listeria monocytogenes. I tell our auditors, if you are reviewing environmental monitoring and they never, ever have any presumptive positives, then I'm just going to tell you the site's not looking in the right spot, because Listeria is everywhere. It's naturally occurring in the environment. It's in the soil. It's on the bottom of people's shoes when they come into your site. So it's going to be somewhere. Occasionally, you're going to get a presumptive positive. However, I worked in a site where we suddenly saw our presumptives go from a random one every now and then to suddenly we were consistently getting several per week, and the number was increasing. And immediately, senior leadership said, you know what, we've always felt like it was our mobile equipment that was causing these random presumptive positives. So we need to implement corrective actions on the wheels of our mobile equipment, our bicycles, our maintenance carts, our fork trucks. And so we, started throwing quat powder on the floor for the equipment to drive through when they entered into the production area. We cleaned and sanitized the wheels. We did all kinds of things. And you know what? The number of presumptive positives continued to grow. And so obviously we hadn't found the root cause. So we needed to transform our data. And so we used a measles chart. I color coded by month where those presumptive positives were being identified. And what we found was mobile equipment couldn't go to the areas where the presumptive positives were being found. We were finding it on platforms where people stand. We were finding it between racks where only people could go. So we really hadn't done a good root cause analysis. So once we transformed the data into a measles chart, identified the locations, what appeared to be random were no longer random. We found clusters where the mobile equipment couldn't go, but only personnel could walk. And then we identified that the one thing that all those personnel had in common was the washroom. And we did a massive clean and sanitation of this washroom. We started putting our quat powder down inside the washroom so that as people were coming in and going out, the bottom of their shoes were covered in the quat powder. And you know what? Immediately we dropped back down to no presumptive positives, or again, that one random occasional presumptive that we saw. So we had identified the root cause, but we didn't identify it till we transformed our data into something useful. And then the last thing I'm going to talk to you about, act on your data. So this is an example dating back to my automotive days. And I walked in to do some training at a facility and they said, yeah, we collect data on control charts. And they were collecting data on a radius, and their radius gauge only gave them a 0.5 or a 1.0 measurement. So they literally had 20 years worth of control charts that looked like this. It was either 0.5 or it was 1.0. And at no time in 20 years had they ever had anything out of specification. At no time did they ever have to make any changes based on the data they were collecting, because all they were doing was collecting it and putting it in a box. And then maybe after 10 years, they'd throw it away. So they weren't doing anything with it. So when I see something like that, I want to ask, why are you collecting the data and not using it for improvement? So make sure you're collecting the right data. And then are you prepared to respond when you do identify an issue? So for example, if you took a food safety culture survey, and a lot of our sites did, it's not required per the code, but a lot of our sites took a food safety culture survey, were you prepared to take action on the answers you got? Okay, so you always need to be aware of that. Because what perception is given if no action is taken, right? Nobody cares. Why did I waste my time filling out a survey if nobody did anything? And it's just the perception. Maybe you did take actions and you didn't communicate it. So making sure you're acting on your data and communicating the results. All right, the last example, I do this when, we're in person, cost of quality example. So I always ask sites, identify one part of cost of quality that needs improvement in your company. For example, I would focus on customer complaints. That's a common one, right? And then make a plan. So understand your data, transform it, whether you're using a Pareto chart or, even a measles diagram to find out where those customer complaints are coming from, and then act on your data. And I will just say, with cost of quality, they say that for every $1 that a site puts into prevention, and notice what's there in your prevention: training, process control, approved suppliers, research and development. For every dollar you spend in prevention, you will reduce appraisal, which is your inspections and things like that, and your failure costs by as much as $7 to $10. So if you take something away from the webinar today, it would be this. Identify something where you can make an improvement using data, and then follow those tips and techniques to carry out your plan. So that is it for my presentation today. I think we're up for questions. So I'm going to turn it back over.
Holy moly, Tammie, there's a lot of stuff you covered today, and it was amazing. I took a ton of notes. Yeah, this was really. I'm smiling. I'm sorry. It's if you
Well,
saw me
good.
right now, I look extremely happy because I'm just so fired up. Okay, so first thing, thank you for letting us know when we can expect the new edition. I think that has
That
has
is frequent
has been
question.
the number one question on everybody's mind. So that's good to know that it most likely will not be until 2025, but we'll keep watch on, and hopefully we'll have you back to Beyond Compliance so you can give us another update later. Um,
Awesome.
the big question that I see coming up here is around how do you know, I'm paraphrasing a bunch of questions here, but how do you know if you're using the right data sets to collect that uh, the proper information you need to make the continuous improvement effort? So you gave a couple of examples where it's like, oh yeah, we've been doing this for years. Everything's fine. It's all green, right?
Yeah,
But you don't have the awareness that there are issues. You just don't know what you don't know. So where's
exactly.
the biggest hang up that you find?
Yeah, so that's a great question, because sometimes it's just trial and error. Sometimes like my example with the top 10, versus looking at the top 5 clauses. Sometimes it's just looking at data a couple of different ways before you see that anomaly, that data just kind of shows you something to look at. So sometimes it's a little bit of trial and error. But also sometimes it's really just looking at the data. I see so many people that they just don't know where to get started. And I would just recommend jump in, get started, trending it some way. And if you're not seeing a trend that you can act on, then try to turn it around and look at it a different way. Because sites that score excellent or score 100 on their audits, I always just caution people that kind of gives you a false sense of security that, hey, I'm good. But are you missing something? And I was the same way. We used to never get any presumptive positives on our swabbing. And then I had a corporate food safety VP who came in and he said, "Are you swabbing there? Are you swabbing there?" And I was like, "No." And he's like, "Swab there, see what you get." And it just took someone else coming in and giving me a different perspective on my plan, because again, sometimes you are too close to the data. So yeah, so look at different resources. If you're part of a larger company, getting sister facilities involved, because I would go to sister facilities and identify things that jumped out at me, but maybe they were too close to the situation to see. So yeah, play around with the data. And if you don't use pivot tables, I would absolutely recommend you get some training on pivot tables, because were life-changing for me, because it allowed me to see just beyond a standard Pareto chart. So yeah, there's lots of tools out there to use.
Yeah, I know you mentioned a couple before, like Power BI, other third-party sources, and yeah, it all does come down to resources and support. So this brings up that point you made about food safety culture,
Yeah,
and we talk about this a lot. It seems to be bubbling up now. If you read some of the media outlets, they are saying that the food safety culture issue is kind of broken because nobody's really effectively talking to each other internally. It's a lot of siloed groups. Yes, they're solving problems on their own, but they're not sharing information the way they should. I guess could you validate that assumption?
Yeah.
And yeah,
Yeah, so a food safety culture, as I said, I always looked at it as it was inherent in the code. And I would get customers to come in and they didn't even need to walk past my hand wash station before they were already commenting on the food safety culture in my plant. They could just see it, and I always tell people, when we first started talking about non-conformances were written because there was not a food safety culture procedure. And I said, it's not a procedure, it's not a plan, it's not a program, it's not a survey. Food safety culture is people doing the right things, even when they think nobody's watching. And so that's what you're striving for, and you're supporting that. So it comes in a lot of different ways. And so I would absolutely agree with the fact that people have to talk to each other. People have to, and it really starts with that senior leadership driving that. That's why the code is written from a perspective of senior leadership support for a food safety culture and not a procedure. So, getting everybody hands-on when it comes to food safety. So whether it's doing a Gemba walk each day, or whether it's getting other departments involved in the SQF audit or the customer audits, those things should be all hands on deck. So I always love to have an auditor come in because they'd say, oh, hey, I'm ready to talk about preventative maintenance. And I'd be like, okay, hold on, let me get my maintenance manager. They didn't audit me for preventive maintenance. I was the SQF practitioner, but they didn't audit me for preventive maintenance. They audited my maintenance manager. So I just can't say enough about how senior leadership has to drive that from the top down, or it's never going to work. And communication is key, as you said.
yeah, and again, this kind of ties back to when you were talking about how you mapped out the listeria outbreak, not outbreak, but the issue or presumptive positives through the measles chart.
Yeah.
That was a really unique approach that I think a lot of people, because they're moving too fast, they're focused on a lot of fires, not literal fires, but
Yeah.
issues
No,
that might be
I
happening.
always said I was a firefighter.
Yeah, you know what I'm saying? So it's like how do you kind of slow down to speed up? How do you take the time to say, hey, you know what? Let's actually map this out in the way that you explained in that example. And I know that that's a very specific example, but again, enabling people to take the time to think through all of the different various data sources you have and looking at it from multiple directions instead of just like you said, like if you're too close to the data, you're not going to see the thing that you need to see.
Exactly. I think just understanding that, we're all different and some people need to be shown things in different ways. So for some people, an Excel spreadsheet is great. They can see the data, they can see the trends, things can jump out to them. But for many people, that's not the case. And so we need to make sure we're looking at that data in different ways. And, my example was just out of desperation. We kept looking, and no matter what we did, things kept increasing. So finally I was just like, bring me a map. And I got my little markers and I did it just on a table, and I color coded it by date and location so we could see how it was changing and moving and spreading. So sometimes it just requires you to think outside the box and present data in a different way so that people can understand it. A lot of people are visual, thinkers and visual understanders, so they really need those charts and those other tools. Is not matrix. I teach about that a lot, and that's a very simple tool that hardly anybody uses. But my gosh, it's so powerful because it looks at a problem and it says, here's what the problem is, here's what the problem is not, and then what's the difference, so that you can see where you need to put your focus. So just finding that right tool to make that presentation of data work for your particular problem. I hate to see sites that have put in a corrective action procedure that says we will do a 5Y for absolutely every problem. Just stop it. A 5Y is great It's powerful. It's useful for many issues, but for many issues, a 5 why won't work. So don't kind of single yourself out to where you limit yourself in your problem solving. So use a variety of tools, have a toolbox, and pull out the appropriate tool when needed.
Yes, have a toolbox. We are running out of time. I just wanted to go back to this slide here because I love that quote you said. For every dollar spent on prevention, you reduce your failure cost by, I think you said $7.
$10, yeah, absolutely.
That's incredible. That's incredible. And this obviously is where SQFI comes into play. And since we're literally at the top of the hour or the bottom of the hour, can you provide some resources or a URL website that folks can learn more about maybe bolstering their training or their process control processes?
Absolutely. So our website is www.sqfi.com. Up at the top, it will say resources. There's one tab for resources and there's one tab for training and events. So you can go to the resource page. You can find all of our codes, which are downloadable for free, including our quality code. You can also find all kinds of tip sheets and guidance documents that talks about a variety of topics. You can go to the training tab and see the training that we offer here at SQFI. We just released a new online training bundle this year for risk assessments, and it covers food fraud, it covers food recall, and food defense and all those things that you need to do a risk assessment for. We just released that can be seen there as well. And then links to all of our training centers where you can get some additional classes. There's something for everybody. So definitely check us out, sqfi.com.
Awesome. Okay, good. We'll be sure to send that link along with the recording and the slides of today's presentation. Tammie, we really appreciate it. You are a rock star. I definitely want to have you back on because there's so much I need to learn about this stuff. And of course, we thank you and we thank everybody for joining us today. Look out in your inboxes for more information from SQFI and Safety Chain. Thanks again, everybody. I hope you have a great rest of your Wednesday.